Welcome to the Alabama Public Health Training Network. Thank you for joining us for our program, Annual Statewide Out-of-State Travel Training. If you have questions about anything being discussed today, please call or email during our broadcast. The phone number and the email address are on your screen now and will appear later in the program. Also, the handouts are available online. You will need to register for this program in order to access that material. Now let's meet our presenter, Chandra Lewis, Out-of-State Travel Liaison, Bureau of Financial Services, Alabama Department of Public Health. Chandra.
Thank you, Ashley. Good afternoon, everyone. We are here for our annual statewide out-of-state travel training. This is something that we do statewide once a year, and we decided to do a statewide webcast this year because not everyone can travel to Montgomery, so we wanted to make sure this was accessible to everyone at the same time and make sure everyone has the same information. Right now, the number one question that I get is, how soon can I submit, upload, or work on my travel requests? And the answer to that is the next slide. It's as soon as you know. If it's a manual travel, meaning that there are some extenuating circumstances, I need it at least, sorry about that, as soon as you know. In order to comply with the governor's submission guidelines, I have guidelines as well. Manual travels 1 to 2 months in advance, which means you as a designee may start working on it as soon as 8 weeks in advance, 8 to 6 weeks in advance. If it's an automated routine travel that does not have any extenuating circumstances, I would need to begin processing it no less than 2 to 3 weeks before that traveler is set to depart. And let's go through our glossary, and at this time we'll switch to the laptop because we do have some examples of the terminology that will be used in communicating with the travel liaison. And if everyone's ready to go on that page, let me tell you a little bit about me and who I am. I am your point of contact between the Alabama Department of Public Health and the governor's office. So if you have a question about your travel as it's already gone to the governor's office, has it come back from the governor's office, you can call me, you can email me, you can text me. All of my numbers are listed there, phone and cell. And those numbers are on your screen now, as well as the email address. And they should be in your handout as well. Now what you're seeing now are some examples of a few Form 5s that may have been submitted to the governor's office. There's some writing on it in red or some highlight there. It looks like there may be some information missing. That one looks like it was a temporary, there was some information that was added and some information at the top that says it goes with something else. All of those photos are examples of what's known as an amendment. Those are any updated or altered travel request that replaces a previously approved request, and it must be manually audited, approved again, and physically signed by the governor's office. So if you had a traveler to travel this weekend and their flight got delayed because of weather, we may have some amendments that are coming up. So it's any altered travel that corrects or amends a previously approved travel request. The next one is just a general form. There's no writing on it. It does bear a state health officer's signature as well as a signature of a governor. That's an example of an automated travel. It's a travel request that does not have any extenuating circumstances. It is considered routine, and the final approval pages will bear the governor's signature and the state health officer's signature when you receive those. Okay. This one is, it looks very much like that first one, but as you notice, there's no signature at the bottom. It does not have a governor's signature, although it does look like the final approval sheet. That's an example of a routine travel request that is approved after a departure without the governor's signature, and it requires further audit and must bear a physical signature by the governor's office. That's what we call an auto after. So when you get those back, you'll see the governor's signature and some initials on the bottom at the date the governor actually signed it. This is an example of a travel that either the traveler did not travel, there was some other information that was needed, we may have processed it as an amendment and it was not needed to be an amendment. It's called a cancel. So you would send me an email along with the keyword cancel stating that you needed to cancel a traveler's already approved travel. If it's a manual amendment, anything like that, if the traveler does not travel, you would send me that cancellation email and the travel code that it applies to, or a copy of that manual Form 5 that it would apply to. Some of you may be familiar with this screen, some of you may not. This is an application that's on your Lotus notes, and it's the out-of-state travel system application. When you click that, it takes you to this screen here where you can create a new travel request. This is only for automated travel only. It allows for electronic ADPH tracking and approval of those automated travel requests. If you have sent a Form 5 up to administration to be signed by the state health officer and it bears Dr. Harris's physical signature, do not upload it into Lotus Notes. If it's an automated only, your bureau director will be able to approve it, administration will be able to approve it, and the state health officer will be able to approve it. So you don't want it to get caught in a loop there and get hung up because you're getting double approvals on the same travel. So this is only for automated travels. So I might use interdepartmental system, or I might say Lotus Notes. Those terms are interchangeable. It's the same thing. It all means this system here. Okay, this is an example of a Form 5. It does have some red writing on it, but as you can see at the bottom, it does bear a bureau director signature, the state health officer signature, and the governor's signature with that date and those initials. This is an example of a manual travel. It is a paper travel request that requires physical audit and physical signatures from the traveler, the division head, the state health officer, and the governor. There are manual cover sheets for these types of travels that will determine whether or not it is truly a manual or what makes it a manual. And we'll go over those stipulations a little bit later. Some of you may be familiar with this screen. The website is at the bottom, oos.alabama.gov. This is the out-of-state travel website that's hosted directly by the governor's office. I use this to submit all automated travel requests to the governor's office. You as an individual travel designee can only use this site to manage existing travel. And by manage existing travel, you would go to oos.alabama.gov. You would click the blue Manage Existing Travel button here at the home page. If you have your unique 8-digit travel code, you would enter it here. And at this site, you would be able to check the status. You can view the travel packet that was uploaded. You can view or reprint your final approval form. However, if you do, it will have the governor's signature, but it will not have the state health officer's signature. You would need to then send it to me. So if your traveler lost their approval form, just let me know, and we can get another one with the state health officer's signature. And then this is where you would go to submit the travel expense form on that purple bar, or view or print the expense form that was submitted or created. Resets. This is an example of a reset email. I would need the keyword, the date of departure, the traveler's last name, the destination, city, and state, as well as the corresponding travel code. A reset is used to completely erase finalized expense reports from the out-of-state travel system if mistakes have been made. So if you accidentally charge your traveler $300 for dinner and they spent $30, we would need to request a reset for that and completely erase that travel expense report from the system. Those are completed at the governor level, and it typically takes 1 business day after it's requested from me to be completed. So I would send you an email the next business day at the earliest, letting you know that you could enter those corrected expenses. And we've seen another Form 5 like this before. It has some red writing on it. What's interesting to notice is at the bottom, there's a date stamp there, but it has the letters RTN and another date. That's an example of a return. That means we audited this travel here at ADPH, we sent it to the governor's office, and it was rejected at the governor's office for whatever reason. So we then have to figure out what happened and then send it back. But a travel can be rejected at the governor's office. So if you ever get a final approval and it has that RTN on the bottom, that just means that there was a little bit back and forth between myself and the governor's travel liaison regarding this particular travel. Okay. This is that automated form again, but what is the feed of interest is at the bottom. There's a red box. There is a unique 8-digit identifier here. That's what's known as the travel code. So you've heard me refer to the travel code here throughout this presentation. That's what that is referring to. It's the unique 8-character alphanumeric identifier for completed automated travel requests. If you have a manual, you will not have a travel code. It's only for automated travel requests. And it is case sensitive. So however you see it on the page, that's how you type it in the computer. Let's talk a little bit about you guys. Who are you? You are what's known as a travel designee. You are my bureau-specific point of contact. You're responsible for preparing the request. You may be responsible for entering them into the interdepartmental system. You may be responsible for processing the reimbursements and the expense forms when your traveler returns. Or there may be someone else in your bureau or area that is responsible for that as well. But if you have access to that Lotus Note system, you are considered my travel designee. And a new term that we've had to use a little bit more frequently at the end of this fiscal year is called a release. And I would also need that keyword, that date of departure, the traveler's last name, their destination, city and state, and that travel code. And what a release is, it means that you have a signed Form 5 in your hand. You have the state health officer signature on it. You have the governor's signature on it. But when you go do that expense report, you're locked out. It gives you an error code. That means it's still locked for auditing at the governor's office. And I have to request that that specific travel be released so that we can submit those expenses. It also takes about 1 business day from the date that I requested. And I would send you an email letting you know that you could submit those expenses. Let's talk a little bit about the travel process. I know the travel process can be a little confusing. What happens to it after it leaves your hand? What happens to it when it goes up to administration? What happens to it even when I get it? So, as the travel designee, you prepare the request. You either enter it into the interdepartmental system in Lotus Notes, or you submit the manual request for approval. If it's in the interdepartmental system, you upload it, you have your bureau director review and approve it, administration reviews and approves it, and the state health officer reviews and approves it. After the state health officer reviews and approves it, then I see it, and I can print it out, then I review and approve it. A lot of errors that I'm finding is that it's not being reviewed at the bureau level before it reaches me. So make sure, stress with your bureau director that they have to review it before they approve it. If it's a manual request, the travel designee creates it. It is reviewed and physically signed by the traveler. It is reviewed and physically signed by the bureau director. It's reviewed and physically signed by the state health officer, and it will be reviewed and physically signed by the governor. So because so many hands have to touch those manual packets, that's why it takes a little bit longer. And I need them at least a month to 2 months in advance so that we can go through that manual approval process. Now, after state health officer approves them, what do? I print out and audit every single travel request that I receive. If it requires errors, I will send them back to the Bureau for correction, or if they're flying, I will email you and tell you to have your traveler go ahead and purchase their ticket. Once they purchase their ticket and receipt, you would then send that to me so that I can get final approval from the governor. I make electronic copies of all of the travel packets and then submit them for final approval at the governor's level. The governor's office audits every request that they receive. They make a determination of whether or not it's approved or rejected for corrections. If it's rejected, they'll return it, and we'll have a conversation about it and figure out what's going on. If it's approved, they will send me the signatures, which is why when you get them, they're already signed by the governor. I field any and all objections. I field any and all questions. I request more information if necessary, and I try as much as possible to diligently track those changes in the interdepartmental system so you can see when they're sent to the governor's office, if they were returned from the governor's office, and when they are approved. You as a travel designee receive those final pages. You update your traveler. You would then prepare the reimbursement when they come back or use a travel code on the out-of-state system. At this time, we'll talk about a few helpful hints and some things that I find helpful when reviewing and auditing travel requests. And the first thing that I found helpful, and it kind of ensures a measure of accountability in the larger bureaus and larger areas, if you have multiple people preparing travel request packets, but you only have one or two people that have access to Lotus notes in that interdepartmental system to upload them, this out-of-state travel checklist is really helpful. It goes through whether or not the memos are included, whether or not there are multiple travelers, if you've included the mileage map from home and from work base. And also at the bottom, there is a completed by line and a reviewed by line. This would be helpful for that travel designee that has multiple people under them preparing travel requests. Because if there is something that's incorrect at the bureau level, you can catch it before it even comes all the way up the pipeline and up the chain to me, and I would have to send it back. The next page was our old out-of-state travel manual cover sheet. This sheet is no longer one that we use. It is now void. It has been revised, so we will no longer accept this manual out-of-state cover sheet. If you go to the document library under finance and out-of-state travel, there are 2 new manual cover sheets. The first one, it requires a 1 month in advance submission for me, no matter what, which means, like I said, you would start working this 6 to 8 weeks in advance. The criteria to make this a 1 month advance manual request are personal time, if they're traveling out of the country, if they're going to Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, anywhere that's not in the contiguous 48 contiguous United States, If they have first-class business tickets, if they have a flight non-availability, if they're driving to a destination and it's over 8 hours away, they want to drive to Massachusetts, if they are departing from or returning to a destination outside of Alabama. So if you have someone in your office that lives in Georgia, they're based here in Alabama at one of our county areas, county health departments, or even here at the central office, but they're going to an out-of-state event, you would still have to do a manual travel for them because their base is outside of Alabama. The travel method is anything other than airline or vehicle. So if they're carpooling, if someone's coming to pick them up, if there are any extenuating circumstances, if their lodging involves a condo, a group rental, or Airbnb, anything like that, or any unusual circumstance, you would use this and submit it no later than 1 month in advance. The second manual cover sheet is something that's new for us. It is something that we would normally consider a routine travel, but if any of these items apply, it would automatically make it a manual travel. So if you go to Google Maps and you type in their home address and it does not come up, Google Maps does not recognize their home address, this is automatically a manual travel. However, it is not subject to that 1 month in advance rule. This will be the 2 to 3 weeks in advance. If they are coming into Alabama, so they live in Texas, they're coming in to speak at an ADPH event, this would be one of those manual requests. If they are flying out of 2 separate airports, flying into Chicago, they come into O'Hare, but they're flying out of Midway, it would be a manual request. If they are taking a red-eye flight, it would be a manual request. If they have to fly into an airport, pick up a rental car, and drive the rest of the way, it would be a manual request. Sometimes, as far as meals, we do have travelers that have to pay for meals in advance. We would put those fees in that manual request first, just to make sure that they don't exceed that cap. The next form is our out-of-state traveler form. This form is only to be used if there are multiple travelers going to the same event from the same bureau. I've seen some travel requests where they've been put in for just one traveler. I don't need it for just one traveler. If it's multiple travelers from the same bureau going to the same event, then we would use this multiple traveler form. We do have bureaus that work with each other, that you have more than one employee from the different bureaus going to the same event. They would do one for their bureau, you would do one for yours, and then we would cross-reference it when I got it. But for you guys, same thing I just said, multiple travelers from the same bureau attending the same event. And this is my best friend when I'm auditing travel requests. These are our timing guidelines. First thing I do, I pull out the agenda, I pull out the Form 5, and I pull out the timing guidelines. Are they leaving home? Are they arriving? Are they departing their destination? Are they coming back within what would be acceptable for state of Alabama guidelines? At the bottom, the following suggested methods of travel are from the governor's office. So if you are 0 to 4 hours away from your destination, the suggestion is that you would drive. If you're 4 to 8 hours away from your destination, you can drive or fly. If you're 8 hours away from your destination, the suggested method is that you fly. However, the caveat is that manual travel request, if you have someone that wants to drive over 8 hours, then we would need to work on that as soon as possible. If business participation begins before 5 p.m. and they're flying, your traveler can arrive no earlier than 24 hours prior. So if it begins at 8 a.m. on Monday, they can arrive at their destination after 8 a.m. on Sunday. If they're flying and it ends after 2 p.m., then they have until 2 p.m. the following day to leave. They cannot leave any later than 2 p.m. the following day. If it ends at or before 2, they have to come home the same day. If they're driving 0 to 4 hours here to Atlanta and it ends before 5, they have to depart the same day. If it ends at after 5, they have to leave at 8 a.m., well, no later than 8 a.m. the next day. If they are driving and it begins before 2 p.m. and it's 0 to 4 hours, they can arrive no earlier than 5 p.m. the day before. If it begins after 2, then they can arrive no later than 2 hours prior to the start of business. And when they're driving more than 4 hours, there's some additional guidelines that apply as well. So the first thing to do is to get with your traveler and talk through what they want to do and make sure it would fit standard business. The next page is a website that I find helpful, and it's www.timebie.com. and it is a time calculator. I use the second part, the time of day calculator, and that's helpful when I'm calculating, especially times where they need to get to the airport or leave the airport, or driving times from here to Atlanta. I start with, as you can see, 12:55, which is the time that their flight is supposed to leave. Then I would subtract that driving destination time, and then about an hour and a half for TSA for airports. And then it would give you that time difference of what time they would need to leave home there. One question that comes up is tips. How do we calculate tips? Tips cannot be requested on the pre-approval. So on that Form 5 at the bottom, where it says other expenses, please do not put $10 for tips. They cannot be requested on the pre-approval. It's only on expenses for services that have already been performed with the receipt documentation. You can only claim if applicable and the circumstances permit. There must be a written statement on the receipt to which each service applies. If you're tipping your SkyCap at your airport when you leave or when you return, or your airport shuttle, it's $2 to $3 per large checked bag on the airfare, on the baggage receipt per airport. So they fly out of Montgomery, they tip their SkyCap $2 to $3. They arrive in DFW, they can tip their SkyCap $2 to $3. So you may have a $6 tip on that baggage receipt. So it's $2 to $3 per large bag per airport. Taxi, Uber, commercial shuttle, your tips can only be 15 to 20% of the fare, and it must be written on the taxi or shuttle receipt. There has been some question this year from the comptroller's office about whether or not we can use Uber. The governor has no problem with us using Uber, but for the comptroller, make sure that receipt has the driver's information, or Uber does offer business cards. Grab the driver's business card if they have one. That way you can claim that as part of your transit. If the hotel offers a free shuttle, you can tip $2 to $3 per large checked bag written on the hotel receipt. The hotel bellhop, you can tip him $2 to $3 per large checked bag on arrival or departure only. So that's the only time the bellhop is going to touch your bags. Your hotel maid service, you can tip $2 to $3 per night, every night except the first night, because those services are not provided on the first night. And it's written on the hotel receipt next to the corresponding night. Hotel parking, complimentary self-parking is the first choice. However, if it's valet only, you can tip $2 to $3 per in and out service as customary, or 15 to 20% of the total services at the end. It's written on the hotel receipt next to the parking charges. And your meals. There is a 15 to 20% tip for meals included in your daily cap. So if you're in Atlanta and your meal cap is $64 a day, that $64 should include 15 to 20% of that tax. If you tip over 15 to 20%, God bless you. You're a great person. Thank you for your generosity. But you can only claim 15 to 20%. If you go over that meal cap, that $64, you can adjust your meals so that you get down to that amount. So you may forego your tip, or you may forego part of another meal if that's something that you want to claim. But you do write that tip on the food payment receipt and as well. The next question that comes up a lot is, can I claim my breakfast? Can I claim lunch? Can I claim my dinner? A traveler may claim their breakfast if on their approval sheet they are scheduled to depart from home prior to 6 a.m. If they are flying out of Mobile and they are scheduled to depart at 6:30, but they decided to leave home at 5 so that they would have enough time to get through TSA, because their Form 5 says 6:30, they would not be eligible to claim that breakfast. So according to whatever time they are approved to leave, it has to be prior to 6 a.m. in order to claim breakfast. If there's a question about lunch, they must be approved to leave home prior to 11 a.m. If they leave home at 12:30 and grab a burger, we won't be able to claim that one. And then they may claim dinner anytime they're due to return home after 7 p.m. Now, as far as these times, if you're scheduled to leave home before 6, you can eat breakfast anytime between 5 and 10:30. If you leave home before 11, you can eat lunch anytime between 10:30 and 4. And you can eat dinner anytime between 4 and 10. However, if you eat your lunch at 3:30 and then have your dinner at 4:30, you're going to have to pick a meal because it's too close in time frame. And also, meals cannot be consumed within 45 minutes to an hour of base. So say you have a traveler that went up to Nashville and they're driving back to their base here in Montgomery. If they don't stop prior to Birmingham, they won't be able to claim their meal. Just so advise them to eat in Nashville before they leave, or somewhere along, stop in Huntsville or Athens or somewhere like that. Because 45 minutes to an hour before their base, they will not be able to claim that meal. And now I would love to get into the travel packet, and I may spend a little bit more time here going through the travel packet because it's really intimidating for a lot of people, and we don't want that. The first sheet that we have is the travel pre-approval request packet. This is located on the document library if you don't already have one. What it is it's a cheat sheet for what should go in your pre-approval request. It tells you about the Form 5. It tells you about the memo and who it should be addressed to. It tells you about the personal info insert and the information that we would need for your traveler. We would need their name, their employee ID, and their EMAP address as reported to GHRS or payroll. If they don't know what EMAP is, pull up your pay stub. It's the address that's on your pay stub. That's what we would have to put in our system. The flight itinerary, if you have one, which must be highlighted, the dates, the times of travel, and the cost. A full agenda, which includes dates and times, which are highlighted in yellow. 2 Google mileage maps, not Yahoo, not MapQuest, have to be Google. 1 from their home base and 1 from their work base. I don't need the turn-by-turn directions, just the first page that shows the route from beginning to end. The hotel reservation and quote is necessary, as well as the meal allowance form for their destination city. If you have any questions about where to find the meal allowance form, it's on the document library under Finance Out-of-State Travel. There's a link that'll take you to the governor's website for those meal allowances. The conference registration fee invoice, bill, or receipt would go at the back of the packet. And if your area administrator, bureau director, or anyone else requires any additional paperwork, so if you're flying out of Atlanta and you must do a cost comparison with your flight and your mileage compared to flying out of Montgomery, that information would go at the back. Optional would be any anticipated transit expenses. However, it's a good habit just to request the maximum for transit if they're flying, which is $150, and that way you don't have to try to guess how much those fares would be. Okay. The next page is the Form 5. This is the story of your trip. from beginning to end. And it is a lot of information. It is very detailed. However, for me, it's easy to break the Form 5 down into 4 parts. So with the Form 5, Part 1 is your information, your traveler's information, your agency, your division, the date, the governor's name. Make sure you get it right. Our governor is Ivy. I have seen some with the wrong governor's name on it that we've had to send back, and it may just be an old form that was saved on a computer that we didn't update. So make sure we update those saved Form 5s. The first thing to notice is in green, I've highlighted the year. Anytime there's a change at the government level, maybe motor pool or personal mileage, the Form 5 is updated. So make sure that you're using the latest form. I have received forms with the wrong fiscal year, and that changes the money. The latest one we have was revised 01/01/2017. That's the one that we're using right now. So far for FY18, there have been no updates in the money portion of travel. So we're still using this 01/01/17 Form 5. It's the first thing to notice. Is that correct? Another way to tell whether or not you're using the correct Form 5 is skip down to Part 2. Look at the amount for motor pool and look at the amount for personal mileage. The amount for motor pool should say 47 cents. The amount for mileage should say 53.5. If those two figures don't match, then you're probably using a previous year's form. But back to Part 1. You would list the city, the state, and the country. Of course, the country is U.S. Whether or not it is a conference, a meeting, if it's job specific, or if it's training. And you would list the name of the event in the line afterward. Their home-based city, their work-based city, and whether or not personal time is requested. And if I would ask you to go ahead and star personal time, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. The second part of Part 1 is whether or not they're driving or flying. If they're driving the entire way, you would check that first box. If they're flying, you would just check the second. You don't have to check drive and fly. Whether or not they're driving from home or work would go in that first blank. And then whether or not they're driving to a city or an airport code would go in the second. Then you would list the miles, the time, whether it's hours or minutes. And then the first line, under drive, where I've made some notations, you would put home or work and list which one they were driving from. Because if you're based in Montgomery and you work in Montgomery, it's a little bit confusing to figure out if you're leaving from home or work based on, and we have to go through the whole packet and find out whether it's mileage. So in that first line, you note whether it's just home or work. And then we can refer back to the cities above it. If they're flying, you would use airport codes in lines 2 and lines 3. If they're driving, you would just drop down and put the city where I have that blue highlighter there. So depart home or depart work. MGM would be the airport code for Montgomery, and DFW would be Dallas-Fort Worth if they were flying. Or you would say departing from home or work, and just drop all the way down and say Atlanta if they were driving to Georgia. So only use the city if they're driving. If they're flying, use airport codes. And the same on the opposite side. Travelers must depart and return to the same place. So if they depart from work, they return to work. I know sometimes on the weekend, if they return on a Sunday, we like to say they're returning back home. No. Travelers depart and arrive at the same place. All right. Part 2 just tells me how you're traveling, whether or not you're using a car, you're a driver or a passenger, how many round-trip miles you're taking, if you're taking an agency vehicle or a motor pool vehicle or your personal vehicle. If you're taking your personal vehicle, I would need for you to explain to me why, whether it's personal preference, you have no access to the motor pool, if it's a third-party pay and they won't refund, they won't reimburse those those motor pool miles, you would just put that information there. And then you would list the mileage the round-trip mileage that you're due to drive. Under that is whether or not you're flying. If you're flying, you would list your carrier. You would list who you purchased it from, whether or not a travel agency was used. So if you purchased it from Delta and you got it on the internet, Delta's your carrier, Delta.com is who you purchased it from. Or American Airlines, AA.com, Expedia, Cheap Tickets, Priceline, that information would go there. The amount of your ticket does include fees, but it does not include whether or not travel agency fees are charged. Those go in the next blank to the right of it. If you use a travel agency like Direct Travel, EWA, they typically charge those booking fees and they go in that blank. Another interesting feat is the amount for the bags. Bags do vary. If your traveler is traveling 3 days or less, their baggage fee is going to be $50. If your traveler will be gone 4 days, 3 nights, or more, their baggage will be $120. And that's doesn't matter the carrier. Even if they're flying Southwest and their first one's free, still give them that allowance for the baggage just in case. Airport parking. The best thing to do for airport parking is to check the airport website to find out how much their parking is. We know for years Montgomery parking was $8. Now it's $10. And back in March, they decided to change. They changed their fees and they went up. They didn't notify anyone. We didn't find out until travelers came back and their parking was a little bit different from what they were approved for. So always check the airport website to make sure you have the most current. Also, if you are flying out of Montgomery, add $1 to the airport parking. So if it's 3 days, $30, we want to approve them for $31. Just in case your traveler happens to swipe their card at the terminal. There is a $1 convenience fee for using a debit or credit card. Change ticket fees. You can disregard this section. The state of Alabama does not pay for change ticket fees. If the traveler has to change their ticket, that will be a personal expense. Rental cars, if they rent a vehicle, either at the airport or it goes there, or to their destination, it goes there. You'd have to have the quote in the packet as well, but the number of days, the base quote for the company, and the approximate amount that they would spend on gas would also go on the form as well. And whether it's a full-size vehicle, a 4-door sedan, compact, and then the explanation for why they're renting the vehicle. If their final destination is a rural place and they have to fly into a major airport and then drive, that information will go there. Final destination rural. Transit, we discussed that. That's $150. Taxis, subway, shuttles, ferries, etc. Any type of transit that you think that they may have, toll roads, would go there, so we would claim that $150. Event, conference, city parking. Sometimes the hotel is not where the event is held, and they may have to travel to their destination if they're driving. Especially in Atlanta, they may have a conference center that they must park at. That event parking would need to be included here on this pre-approval for that Form 5. Now, Part 3 tells us all about where you're staying. Now, the name of your hotel, whether or not you have business services, and what business services would include is whether or not you have to make a fax, you have to run the Kinkos and make copies for your conference, something like that. Maybe the hotel would charge you 10 cents for printing in their business center. We cap those business services fees at $15, and if they're required, make sure they're listed either a separate receipt or on that hotel receipt. But business services, $15 in that blank. Meals, you would list the dates of the meals, and however many days they're traveling, that's what you would give your traveler for that meals. Now, some agencies break the meals down between breakfast, lunch, and dinner. ADPH does not. So if they have $64 a day, they have $64 a day to use as they see fit. If they choose to skip breakfast and eat heavier lunches and dinners, they can do so. But as long as their meals are $64, if they're due to come back at 3 o'clock, return home, and you as a travel designee says, well, they can only claim breakfast and lunch, so let me give them $28 instead of $64. Still give them the entire $64 because they have that cap for the entire day. You just know that after 3 there shouldn't be any receipts. If there are any conference registration fees, those go toward the bottom of Part 3, and any other expenses will go at the bottom of Part 3 as well. So if there's a conference registration fee and there may be a textbook fee or a tuition fee or something like that, you would list those there. I think we do have some courses that have some fees to them. The grand totals automatically tally on the right-hand side of the screen, but it is important that where the boxes are, you indicate whether they are state funds, federal funds, other funds, or personal funds, wherever there's an amount. Because in Part 4, we have to list the percentages for state, federal, other, and personal. So if it's 100% state funds, the state box should be checked all the way down. Same for federal, same for personal. Print the traveler's name on it, and then have the traveler sign it and the division head sign it. If it's completely automated, go ahead and upload it to Lotus Notes. If it's manual, send it to administration for physical review and approval. The next page is an example of the memo that goes with the Form 5. It's addressed to the State Health Officer from the Bureau Director. Some of you may have other supervisors, so it would be from the supervisor through someone else, then to the State Health Officer. And then the Bureau Director's initials and the preparer's initials, as well as attachments. This is an example of that personal info insert that was referenced earlier. As you can see, we need the traveler's name, their employee ID, which can be found on their pay stub, and that EMAP address, which is also on the pay stub as well. If you do have multiple travelers, you can submit more than one traveler on the same form. That way you aren't doing a single form for each person. This is an example of a flight quote. Because of the way that our approval process is, we must obtain a quote for approval from the State Health Officer before we buy our final ticketed flight. And so that quote price may be a little bit different from what your traveler actually pays. With those quotes, we try to get a flight as close to that quote as possible, which is why after we receive State Health Officer approval, I then email you, hey, it's been approved, go ahead and tell your traveler to go ahead to buy their ticket. And we do that as soon as possible so that we can get one as close to what was quoted in that original travel approval as possible. And that's also one thing to look at. When you have your traveler research those flights and pull those quotes, go back and pull out the this page right here and make sure their flights fall within standard business time. Because if their flights don't fall within standard business time, that may cause a problem with your traveler's approval. This is an example of an agenda, and it was one that I received. Make sure that your dates are highlighted, your times of business are highlighted, beginning and ending. Registration is not state business. The networking sessions are not state business. So for this particular traveler, their state business would begin at 10 a.m. and conclude at 2 p.m. instead of 9 and 3. Okay. This is another example of agendas that we may see where there is a whole event a day ahead on, it looks like September 10th. However, for state of Alabama employees, their state business does not start until 8:30 on, which would have been this past Monday, September the 11th. As you can see, it was Lincoln, Nebraska, so they would have flown, which means they could have arrived in Lincoln after 8:30 on Sunday, meaning they could attend the networking dinner, but it was not a part of state business. They could not arrive until, their state participation did not begin until 8:30. Make sure all days and all times are included in your agenda and that your conclusion time would be highlighted as well. This was one that was not highlighted, but the conclusion time was 4 p.m. on the 12th, which when I received it, it should have been highlighted. 2 Google Maps, one from the work base and one from home base. As you can see, I don't have the turn-by-turn directions on either, just the route from beginning to end for each one. I do have the street addresses, the 201 Tallapoosa Street, which was that particular home base, or Alabama Department of Public Health, which Google recognizes as 201 Monroe Street, to their destination, which was 26650 Perdido Beach Boulevard, or Perdido Bay. And make sure the destination, the miles to the destination, and the times are visible on those maps. Your hotel reservations, it is important to have those quotes there. It'll list the charges per night and also if there are any additional charges. This particular form should be included in your packet. If you look down at the bottom, there are actual additional charges that would need to be listed on that Form 5. At this particular hotel, they charge for on-site parking as well as valet. So you would need to include the amount of that $40 on-site parking on the Form 5. So if you get a reservation from your traveler and you want to know if that hotel indeed charges for parking, always check the hotel website and go to their information page. All of their parking information should be there. And this is an example of that meal expense rate form. The checklist, the link is in the document library to take you to this particular page. And you have someone going to Little Rock, Arkansas. Their daily cap is $54. As you can see, it has been broken out by meal, 13 for breakfast, 15 for lunch, 26 for dinner. ADPH does not limit our traveler to those caps. They would have that entire $54 that day, including tips, to use how they see fit. Okay. And instead of getting into what's wrong with our travel request, let's take a 5-minute break at this time, and then we'll get back into and come back and talk about a little bit why some travel requests are returned. Welcome back. We are now going to talk about some major travel mistakes and what's wrong with this travel request. Why did I get it back? Where do we start? One of the most common major mistakes that I see is with baggage fees, whether or not it's the 50 or the 120, or they should have had 120, we gave them 50. Baggage fees is the most common mistake that I witness on out-of-state travel requests, only followed by airport parking, because we didn't go and verify how much their airport was charging for parking. Atlanta has changed their rates, so make sure you go to the Hartsfield-Jackson website to figure out what the rates are. As mentioned, Montgomery has changed their rates as well. The state of Alabama will only pay for long-term or economy parking. Business services is a common mistake. I did earlier, we did discuss that they were capped at $15. That's for those faxes, the copies, anything else that they would need pertaining to the conference while they're there. Another mistake is the flight itineraries. Either they don't match standard business time, or your traveler purchases completely different flights from what was listed in their quote. That's why we try to ask that your travelers purchase their airfare tickets as soon as possible so that they can try to get the flights that they were quoted. That way we don't have to worry about them being sold out or booked or having to be on standby, or even the price changing as much, because we do know that airfare prices change all the time. Flights not adhering to standard business. One example that comes to mind is we had a traveler in D.C. and they were due to leave by 2 p.m. the next day after their business departed. However, their flight didn't leave until 2:30. So we had to figure out what was going on. We had to speak with the traveler. And ultimately, that traveler ended up having to request personal time because her flight did not adhere to to standard business. Going forward in FY18, if those flights don't adhere to standard business, the traveler will need to change their ticket. And if there's a change fee incurred, that price is paid by the traveler. So ensure as much as you can that those flights adhere to standard business. Another problem is tips going over that 20% cap. Just stress to your traveler that that meal cap that they have per day does include their tip, and tips cannot exceed 20%. Finalizing the expense report without previewing it or proofing it for errors. That does, like I said, cause for a reset at the governor's level. The governor does track our error rate every year for travel. In the state right now, ADPH has the lowest error rate at 25%. We want to keep it that way. So always preview your expense reports before you finalize them. Personal time and comparison quotes. If you have a traveler requesting personal time, you would need to have a comparison flight quote if they're flying for standard business and for personal time. That way you can see how the amounts differ from the same airport and the same airline. That way we're comparing apples to apples. Once they buy their ticket, you need to submit a new quote dated the same day that they purchased their ticket, so that we're still comparing same flights, same airlines, and the price difference for that particular travel. If they are flying out of Atlanta, your comparison quote must include the amount that you would pay them for mileage, because sometimes we know the fare out of Atlanta would be cheaper, but if they're driving to Atlanta and you calculate that mileage, it is just as much, if not more, than flying out of Montgomery. So we would need to include that mileage to truly see if they're saving any money flying out of Atlanta, or if it would just be easier for them or better to fly out of Montgomery. Another mistake that we talked about a little bit earlier is supervisors not reviewing and auditing the request. We're going to stress that you catch this at a bureau level and make sure that your supervisors begin reviewing and auditing the requests, because if they're incorrect by the time they hit my desk, or they will be returned, and that may be some delay, there may be some expenses waiting on, that travel may be waiting to buy their airfare, and by the time we finally get it corrected and approved, their airfare is over $900, which is another issue with the governor's office. It will be a manual travel, whereas it may have been automated before. So review as much as you can at the bureau level before it goes up the pipeline. The previous year's forms being used. Like I said, that changes the money because motor pool is different this year. Personal mileage is different this year. So make sure you are using that latest version of that Form 5, and that is available in the document library as well. Not adhering to the submission deadlines is another major mistake that we see. If you are traveling on Monday and you don't turn your travel in to Friday, it's going to automatically be an auto after, because there's no way I can get governor pre-approval in 2 days. So if it's a manual, at least 1 month in advance. If it's automated, 2 to 3 weeks in advance, because that gives us time to go through our lengthy approval process. Hotel rates and resort fees is another mistake. Resorts like Sandestin, a lot of those down in Florida. There is a resort in, I think there's one in New Orleans as well. They charge an additional resort fee in addition to their nightly rate. So you would have the nightly rate, the tax, and their resort fee. And when that traveler comes back, their bill may be off by $100, $200, $300. So how do we counteract that? We would go to that hotel website to find out if they offer, if they charge those resort fees. You may need to make a dummy reservation and go all the way through the process as if you're paying to get a breakdown of those fees. But you would add that resort fee to the nightly rate. Hotel tax is capped at 20%. So if you have a hotel in Chicago that charges you $24.50, you would take that 4.5% and add it to the nightly rate. And business participation. Make sure their business participation is true business participation. Not the networking, not the dinner, not the social, not the optional lab tour. It is the conference from beginning to end. And then having the state health officer's signature as well as uploading it into Lotus Notes so that that particular request is getting looped in a cycle of approval. The next topic of discussion is prepaid travel. Prepaid travel requires the following elements, and this information is on the document library under out-of-state travel as well in finance. But you must complete a field voucher. You must complete a Form 4, which is the travel advance and prepaid expenses. The out-of-state travel pre-approval that has been signed by the governor, and the airfare receipt with cost and itinerary. We can only do prepaid expenses for commercial airfare. And it's used for reimbursing airfare before the travel begins. No other expenses are allowed for prepaid travel. So you may have some questions about, having to pay for meals or food or anything else. Those would not go on that form. The Bureau Director or Area Administrator signature is required on the field voucher. The notary would be that office manager or someone else in your area, your bureau. The department approval signature line on the Form 4 is left blank for the chief accountant and finance to sign. The traveler signature date and the notary public date on the Form 4 must match. And all signatures must be present on the pre-approval, and the airfare must show payment and cost. This is an example of the field voucher. That field voucher is on the document library, and you would list the EMAP address here and commercial airfare, the dates, and the amount. That authorized signature there is the Bureau Director or Area Administrator. On the Form 4, this is also on the document library. The latest version that we're currently using is dated 04 of 1999. There has not been an update since then. As you can see, there are only a few boxes where you can manipulate information. So the employee name, the social, the dates of travel, and the amount of the commercial airfare. And then that total is automatically populated at the bottom. And one thing to remember for commercial airfare, it is for main cabin or economy only. If they fly Southwest, it is the wanna get away level of airfare, not anytime or anything else. We don't pay for first class, we don't pay for business. So it's economy, main cabin. The traveler has some declarations that they would make. They would sign it. The notary in that particular area would sign it. Do not stamp over your signature if you're using your notary embosser. Your notary embosser seal goes to the left in that white space. And then the department approval is left blank for the chief accountant in finance. This is an example of that final approval page with all signatures. The traveler's signature is required and the supervisor's signature is required. So I would advise you, once you as a travel designee get that final approval, get the original signatures, make a copy of it, because you would submit a copy with a prepaid travel advance if you would need it. You would submit a copy with the you would submit the original with the reimbursement, and you may want to keep a copy in your files for this particular travel request. And then this is an example of the flight itinerary with the times highlighted. It shows that it's an actual ticketed flight at the bottom. There's an e-ticket amount. And then there's a receipt page as well showing that it was paid, the last four of the card, and the amount. All of that information must be submitted with the prepaid travel advance. Also, this is up to each department and bureau head whether or not they would approve a traveler for the prepaid advance. So this isn't something that you're guaranteed. It is bureau specific. So if your bureau director says wait and just be reimbursed all at one time, then that's their particular rules. This is bureau specific. Each department or each bureau may have different rules and regulations on how they handle this. Okay, we'll get a little bit into reimbursements. There are different types of travel, so there are different types of reimbursements. You have required supporting documents for any out-of-state travel reimbursement, and this checklist is also on the document library. This is handy to refer to because it's the complete order that your travel request reimbursement packet should be in. The completed out-of-state official statement of out-of-state travel goes on top. The pre-approval with all four signatures is the second page. Your agenda, your airline receipt with the airline bags receipt, lodging, all of that documentation if they had any tips for bellhop, hotel maid service, or any of that on their respective dates, your conference or registration fee receipt, your airport parking, hotel parking, event parking, toll road receipts, any transit receipts, your mileage map if you had personal miles, and then your meal receipts. So, one thing to notice, snacks are not eligible for reimbursement. So, if you have someone who has diabetes, may possibly, and they have to eat frequently, make sure they're purchasing crackers and coffee and water, and those items alone will not be reimbursable. If there are exceptions, say they are on a strict diet from their doctor and they have limitations about what they can eat, they must have a statement saying, and the documentation, supporting documentation to prove it, I'm on a strict meal regimen from my doctor. Only a bottle of water was purchased at this particular time. So we do take into account health issues and things like that. However, if it's just a regular traveler with no documentation, we're not claiming a bottle of water at the airport, or we're not just claiming coffee and a bagel. That would be your breakfast. So something and for those receipts. That's what we're looking for. If you have a meal reimbursement receipt and it is incomplete, it does not have the restaurant address, restaurant phone number, it's not itemized, it's missing the payment portion, anything, it's not a complete receipt. That's when you would use the missing meal form. The missing meal form is located on the document library, and we do have an example of that a little bit later. So there's that last bullet point on this page does say a complete receipt must include. So everything that's included on a complete receipt, that's a good checklist to make sure when you're looking at those receipts that those items are there. If they are not there, then we're going to have to go back to your traveler and find out if they have additional information or if a missing meal receipt form is needed. You would do an original for your travel reimbursement packet and one copy that you would submit to Health Finance. If it's not submitted in the correct order, accounts payable may return it back to sender so that you can put it in the right order. That's why it's good to refer to this checklist as well as the one for the Form 5, because that's the order that those things should be in before Health Finance receives them. Okay. This is an example of a manual expense report. If you notice, I told you that the manual reports don't have an ID code. That's why the expense report form is different, because this is a form that for a traveler that did not have an ID code. It is on the document library. When you pull up the Excel sheet, look at the bottom at the tabs and make sure you're using the current fiscal year. That way the mileage, the personal mileage or anything like that is not any different. So you would list there where they came, the city, the state, where they're going, if they had any expenses while they're within that destination. If you look all the way to the right under the necessary expense and conference registration, it says detail and amount. That's actually different on the current form that we use. The detail goes on the right, the amount goes on the left, and it'll tally at the bottom. So that's one update to the manual expense form. The next expense form is also located on the document library, and it's called a Statement of Official In-State Travel for Reimbursement of Actual Expenses. Now, this travel is not one that we see very often, but it's one that does happen. A in-state travel with reimbursement for actual expenses is when ADPH is a member of a national organization, and that organization holds conferences every year, and this year it just happens to be in Alabama. We would request that you do for that traveler the yellow Form 5 as if it was an out-of-state travel. Because if you do not and you do in-state travel, you're limiting them to the per diem and the meal caps for in-state travel. The expenses may far exceed that. So if it's a national conference, a national body that ADPH is a member of, that the conference happens to be held in Alabama this time, that traveler can attend, but it will be a manual travel, no later than 1 month in advance, actual expenses. And talk a little bit about automated expense reports. This is what we deal with mostly. Most of our travel is automated. We have very few in the grand scheme of things that have extenuating circumstances. These are the travels with the travel code, and you have to go to the website to prepare the reimbursement form. There are directions on how to prepare the automated reimbursement form on the document library as well. This is only replacing the manual form, not the entire packet. Excuse me. You may have noticed that the comptroller may have green slipped some of your travel requests saying that the travel was automated. Why wasn't the automated form used. That's because if it's an automated travel with a travel code, you must have an automated travel expense form, automated statement of out-of-state travel expenses, for that. The travel codes must be on both documents. That way it's easier to match up. Manual pre-approvals, like I said, do require manual expense or reimbursement forms because they don't have that travel code along with all the other required documentation. Automated pre-approval requires the automated expense form and does most times reduce the wait time for the traveler. Sometimes we do have travelers that return and we're still waiting on the approval from the governor, so we can't do their expense form. But most times it does reduce the wait time for the traveler. The automated pre-approval has a pre-approval confirmation code found below the governor's signature, which is required to access the automated expense form. It must be entered exactly as it appears on the automated approval form, and it's pre-populated based on the original request and the governor's approval. You have to review each item and make adjustments as necessary. Be careful not to request a reimbursement when it's not due, as all receipts are required for proof. So if you do have a traveler that does that prepaid travel advance for their airfare, make sure that they do not request that airfare again in this formal reimbursement. You can zero that out so they don't claim it again. Review the traveler information. If their EMAP address is incorrect, if there's an incorrect spelling of a name, contact me if we need to get it fixed right away. So then that would necessitate a cancellation of that original, and we would upload a new amended with the corrections on it. The travel expenses, the pre-approved travel details page gives a brief summary of the approved travel arrangements. That summary cannot be adjusted. However, what you input can. The departing and return time adjustments can be adjusted. The times can, but not the date. So if they were due to depart at 12:30 and they actually left around 1, that's okay. You can go ahead and put that in the system. But if they were due to depart at 12:30 and they didn't leave until 5, we would need to do a cancellation and an amendment with that traveler explaining why their departure time was so drastically different from what they were pre-approved for. If there is an adjustment in driving mileage, mileage can decrease. If the traveler did not drive, you would reduce it to 0. If the traveler did not drive, for us in our system, it would be easier to do a cancellation. So if they were supposed to drive, they end up being a passenger, someone else drives, we would do a cancellation for both of those travelers and do an amendment and upload the correct information that this traveler B drove and traveler A was the passenger, and vice versa. If they're flying adjustments, if they received the, like I said, prepaid travel advance, adjust that flight amount to 0. But that we do understand that there may be a little fluctuation in airfare tickets. So if they were approved for $445, they ended up paying $458, you can go ahead and put that in the automated system. There is a small buffer there. You can include the airline bag fees, up to $3 per bag both ways on that baggage amount. If the pre-approved baggage airline fees were not used, say they were pre-approved for $120 and they flew Southwest and didn't check their bags, reduce that down to 0 because you don't have the receipts for that, so that's not something that they're being charged for. In-town transit, the cap is $150, but you would enter in what they actually traveled. So if they have their subway fares, their taxi fares, any of that information, you would enter in what they actually traveled. Meals and lodging, meals plus 20%, not to exceed the pre-approved daily allowance. Each meal box needs to be adjusted according to what they spent. So if it was 0 for breakfast, you would put the 0.00 in there, and then whatever they spent for lunch and dinner, and so forth for each day. Meals purchased outside of the approved travel times will not be reimbursed, and the meal allowance does not roll over. So if they didn't spend the $64 on that first day, they don't have 64 plus. It's just $64 per day. If they don't have a receipt, we're not claiming it. That missing meal receipt form does ask that you tape a partial receipt to it, but there is a function, there is a box for lost total receipt, but your traveler would need to include a statement, a signed affidavit that they lost their entire receipt. Lodging costs for hotel parking and business services. There is a 30% buffer in lodging costs that's built into this automated system because you may tip your bellhop, you may tip your maid service, things like that. 20% of your in and out services. So there is a 30% buffer for lodging built into that system. You would enter the daily lodging costs for that particular day in their respective boxes. And we do know that some hotels may charge you $139 on Tuesday and $145 for Wednesday. Whatever that daily amount is for that respective day, that's what you put in the box. Parking and fees. The parking and fees section is for any of the conference registration fees, or if there's street parking, event parking, if a fee was requested but the traveler didn't have to pay that, you would reduce that down to 0 as well. Airport parking may not exceed what was pre-approved. That's why we stress that you go to that airport website to figure out what that parking is. Because if you went by $8 a day at Montgomery and they were actually charged $10 a day, we wouldn't be able to upload that into this reimbursement system. We would end up doing a cancellation and an amendment. We would start from scratch as if that original travel request never existed. Event or meter parking requires special approval, but that is what we would put on that pre-approved request. Typically that may be grayed out on that automated form, but if you needed to put those in, you just call me and say, hey, where do I put it? And we go through the system and figure out where to put it. Pre-approval and proper receipts are required for any expense that we requested for reimbursement. If there's no approval, there's no reimbursement. If there are changes to the mode of transportation, the flight, or the dates, the travel must be amended and resubmitted for approval. If we're doing amendments, if you remember, I told you that automatically makes them a manual, so it may take a little bit longer for them to be audited and reviewed at the governor's level because we have to show what changed and why. The automated expense form does not ask for a Social Security number, but Health Finance, we're going to the VCs now. I think some people still use their social, but I know for in-state travel the VCs are recommended, and I think we're going to start putting the VCs on out-of-state as well. And the funding code information. The funding code information is requested on the Form 5. Make sure you do list that information because you have to put the funding code on the expense report as well. So if where it says funding, you just put WIC or CMS or some other fund that we have, we need to know what actual fund this is coming from. So FB, RH, we need the actual fund code on that Form 5 and on the expense report. This is back to that example of that Form 5. As you can see, it lists Montgomery at 10:02 as a departure and back to Montgomery at 11:03 p.m. as the return. They have their airfare, their bags, airport parking, Their lodging and parking is included, the number of nights, their transit fee, and whether or not they have conference fees. So looking at this Form 5 as a travel designee, you can already kind of have in your mind what receipts to look for on their way back. Some travel designees have found it helpful to send an envelope with their traveler and say, put everything in this folder, whether it's a manila folder or just a white business envelope, and make sure you bring this back to me. We have had some travelers to forget every single bill receipt that they've had. For a reimbursement packet, no more than 3 missing meal receipts. I would cap it at 3. If you have more than 3, we need to know, why aren't you keeping your receipts? What's on it? What's going on? Also, meals. If you are consuming alcohol, state of Alabama will not pay for alcoholic beverages. So it's a best practice to have your alcohol on a separate receipt. When you come back, make sure you have an itemized portion of that receipt. Sometimes, when we're paying with our card, we leave that itemized portion in the server's book. We need that. We need the itemized portion of the receipt as well as the payment portion of the receipt. But alcohol, separate receipt. If you get a margarita pizza, which we all know is tomatoes, basil, and fresh mozzarella, and it's MERGH. ERITA. Sometimes the comptroller will green slip them and say that state does not pay for alcohol. Just write on the receipt that it's a pizza and not a drink. But yes, stress to your travelers that the state does not pay for alcoholic beverages, because if there's alcoholic beverages on the receipt, you all will now become forensic accountants, because you're going to have to deduct the amount of that alcohol, you're going to have to deduct the amount of that tax, and you're going to have to deduct the amount of the tip from that receipt in order to calculate how much they can get reimbursed for. So tell your travelers, separate receipt for alcohol, because we're not going to pay for it. This is an example of that missing meal receipt form. Like I said, cap it at 3. If it's more than 3, you might want to shoot this reimbursement to the supervisor and say, hey, I don't have what I need to fill this out. Can you ask so-and-so to provide their receipts? Sometimes they aren't responsive to the travel designee, and you may have to do that, but no more than 3 per packet. If the meal is over or under $10, you'd have to choose that. If it's missing the itemized portion, if it's missing the payment portion, or if it's missing a total receipt, you would designate that in Part 2. Part 3, you would choose the reason. Did the traveler lose it? Did the restaurant not give it to them? Did they share a meal and another traveler has the receipt, or other? One thing that we've noticed in other, sometimes with computerized printers, sometimes the dates don't get updated on the printer. And I have seen receipts where they have had 2015 on the receipt, but we know that traveler just traveled, 2017. They traveled last week, but it has September 25th, 2016. You would do a missing meal receipt for that. And note the reason is restaurant printer was not updated. That's one that should not happen all the time, but it has happened. So just be aware. Always check the dates and times on your receipts from the restaurant. Always check the location of the restaurant. We have had some that have traveled to different states for meals, other than the state that they had state business in. So if your traveler's supposed to be in Tennessee and he went down the Smoky Mountains and had dinner in Georgia, you know not to include that receipt. That cost ended up being personal, and it's on them. So check the location, check the dates, check the times, check whether or not it's itemized, whether or not it has the payment, or if it's even a total receipt. If it does not have the restaurant, city, state, or phone number, you would do a missing meal receipt form, because we do need that information. You would write a brief description of what type of meal it was, breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and what was purchased. So entree, spaghetti, Coke, sweet tea, whatever. So brief description of what was purchased, the cost, the tax, subtotal, whether or not they tipped, and the final grand total. The traveler must mark how they paid, whether they paid with cash or with a debit card. And then they must initial all 3 lines. They must initial whether or not no alcohol is being reimbursed, the items being reimbursed are for them, and that they are only requesting actual expenses that were incurred. Okay. That brings us to this site, which is what we use for automated expenses. Only use Internet Explorer when you're getting ready to do a reimbursement on the governor's website. Like me personally, I like to use Chrome. But when doing reimbursements don't always work with Chrome, and so you may be missing a few of the boxes to review or preview. So therefore, only use Internet Explorer. It took us about 2 weeks over Christmas to figure out why we had so many emails about the system being down, and realized that it had stopped working with Chrome, and it only works with Internet Explorer now. You would then go to the Manage Existing Travel. That's where this second screen would come up after you manage existing travel. Once you get to this screen, you would enter in that travel code. Like we said, it is case sensitive, so as it's printed on the paper is how you enter it in. And then you submit your travel expense form. Once you click that Submit Your Travel Expense form, you're taken to this screen. This is step 1 of that automated travel expense, where we ask you to review your traveler's information. So their agency, their division, their name as it is in EMAP or on their pay stub, their address as it is on their pay stub, their official base, the purpose, which would be the name of their travel, and their date of departure, all show on this particular screen. If there's anything that is incorrect on this screen, stop. Call me, email me, because then we'd have to fix it. We'd have to cancel it and do an amendment for that corrected information. If the traveler's address in EMAP differs than what they actually use, at this point, they would need to update their address in GHRS if they want to go with what their current address is. So they have to fill out that Form 11 with their office manager to submit to HR. And then we would have to do an amendment with that updated address. Or they do have the option of completing it with the EMAP address that we have on file. So that, make sure your traveler has the correct EMAP address on file at the pre-approval stage. So if they say, no, I've moved since then, okay, do we need to update your address in the system? What would you like us to do? Or I've moved, but this is still my permanent mailing address. So verify with your traveler what address at that pre-approval stage, so that when we get here, we aren't having to cancel and amend because EMAP addresses are different. Step 2 takes you to the travel expenses page. Much of this page comes pre-populated from that pre-approval, which is good for however many miles they were approved to drive, their departure time. As you can see, you can edit their departure and arrival time. Like I said, 30 minutes or so would work with the system. If you're an hour off or more, you need to figure out or get back with that traveler. What did you do and why? What's going on? If they just decided to leave at a later date, well, I didn't want to leave right now. well, we have to do an amendment now, so you're not going to get your reimbursement yet. So just let them know that try to leave when they're supposed to leave, as close to the time that's on that approval form as possible, because if they don't, it affects their reimbursement and how soon they can get it back. If there are any mileage adjustments for the driving portion, it'll be there. So say that they were allotted 11 miles to drive to the airport, they only ended up driving 9. We would change it and put it there. Those variances can go there. Step 3 is meals and lodging. And this is where, according to their receipts, you would place those amounts for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, and those daily amounts for lodging. Make sure that that daily total that you see, for this case it's $61, the amounts that you input cannot exceed that daily total. If they do, then you would need to adjust and write on the receipt what you were exceeding. So they tipped over 20% and that took them over that $61, not claiming tip for whatever day, and adjust that amount according to whatever your traveler needs to do. If there are no charges, say they didn't eat lunch, one of those $16 you would just zero out. It would be 0.00. So you're only putting in amounts that you have receipts for, or one of those 3 missing meal receipts for. Parking and fees. Parking, if there's a conference fee, it would be pre-populated there. If there is event parking or airport parking, toll roads or anything like that, you would put that information there. If they had event parking, it would be pre-populated as well, because we would have had that on the pre-approval form. So this reimbursement portion should match very closely to what was pre-approved. If there is any change in monies, we need to figure out what was going on. Was there a change in airfare or what have you? This is important. Before you finalize and print, preview. When you preview your expense report, it'll print out and look like this. It has a watermark on it that says preview only. Hand the preview to your traveler and ask them, are these amounts correct? Is this final total what you expect to receive? Have your traveler look over that preview before you finalize your expense report. If there's anything incorrect in that preview, then you have the option to change it or correct it before you finalize it without having to request a reset. So if there was an error in the lodging or an error in the meals or error in airport parking, at this time you can still change it without having to request a reset. Once you preview it, then the finalize and print option will become available, because right now it's not available until you preview it. So once you preview it, you verify with your traveler that it's okay. Finalize and print, and when you finalize and print, it will give you a pre-approved time and a finalized time. Once it's final, it is in the governor system as completed. And that's why we have to request it be canceled and erased so that you can do those corrections. Always preview, always verify with your traveler that those amounts are correct. And the travel code at the bottom, as you can see, that travel code will match on both forms. So that's how you know you're working with the correct form. Make sure your travel code matches all the way throughout. We have had some travels to where they were approved, you received one travel code, they had to be canceled or amended, you received a new travel code. Make sure you're working from the correct travel code, and that's found at the bottom. At this time, before we get into fiscal year 18 updates, we're going to take a 15-minute break. And welcome back to the statewide satellite out-of-state travel training. At this time during this last hour, we will get into some fiscal year 18 updates for out-of-state travel, and we will also have our question and answer period. One major update for fiscal year 18 will be regarding personal time. Governor Kay Ivey's administration will be scrutinizing the use of personal time for state employees and restricting it or determining whether or not it would be approved. If you have a traveler that is requesting to use personal time for an out-of-state travel, we will need to begin discussions at least 6 weeks in advance, because myself, the traveler and the governor's out-of-state liaison will either need to have a in-face person-to-person meeting or a conference call, because the governor's administration will need to ask the traveler some questions about why they're requesting personal time for their particular travel. Also, at that time, we will determine whether or not they could go ahead and purchase their plane tickets. We would agree on the amount that they could be reimbursed for their plane ticket if it's less than what they purchased, and for comparable airfare up to what would be charged for standard business. So all of that information will be discussed in that preliminary meeting before we even sit down to prepare the out-of-state travel request. Another one would be flying to third airports. That is totally eliminated for fiscal year 18. So if your traveler is departing from Montgomery and flying to, just say, Newark, New Jersey, they cannot then catch a flight from Newark to LaGuardia in New York to spend a few extra days there. There will be no third airports allowed. What they would need to do if they wanted to do that is to return to their base and then begin their personal time to that third airport. So just to recap, for FY18, personal time will be severely restricted or need to be approved by the governor's office prior to beginning the Form 5, and there will be no flights to third airports that do not include state business. And at this time, I would like to open it up for our question and answer segment.
All right, I'll go ahead and start with it. I've got one question for you that came in via email. And just a reminder to use at home that you can answer, or excuse me, you can email questions, you can call in with any questions you have. The number and the email address should be on your screen now. So please feel free to email us questions or give us a call. So the question I have right now that's come in is, when can we start submitting new travel requests for after October 1?
Okay, new travel requests can be submitted September 26th at 10 a.m. As of right now, you know that for FY17, the out-of-state travel system is shutting down, so all travel for FY17 will be submitted or will be returned this week. New travel for FY18 can be submitted on September 26th at 10 a.m.
I know we have a couple questions here in the audience. You guys want to go ahead and ask your questions?
Okay.
Can you explain personal time and comparison quotes in a little bit more detail?
Okay. Personal time and comparison quotes. What we did this year in fiscal year 17, if a traveler wanted to take personal time, they would have to provide a comparison quote for the flight that they wanted to take with the personal time attached, and they would also have to supply an airfare quote with standard business time. And we would compare the amount from personal time to what would be comparable for standard business. If the standard business if the standard business amount was less, the reimbursement for that traveler would be capped at what they would have paid for standard business. The rest of the expense for their personal time would be considered a personal expense. However, at the time that they purchased their ticket, they would still need to go back and supply new comparison quotes for state business, so that we're still comparing the correct amount of airfare and capping them on that airfare.
Okay, on your supporting documents for out-of-state travel reimbursement, the mileage map,
Yes.
it says if manually approved and personal vehicle miles are requested. Is that says for manual? Do you not need the mileage map for the auto request?
No, you don't need the mileage map for the automated request, because that would have been submitted and pre-populated on the pre-approval portion of it, which is why in the pre-approval you're requested to submit the Google Map from home and the Google Map from work, so we would have automatically calculated that. But for manuals, you would need to submit the mileage map with the reimbursement if they have personal miles.
Okay. Going back to the national organizations that sponsor conferences in Alabama, you said use the in-state actual expense reimbursement form.
Yes.
But that's an approval process, correct?
Yes, for the national bodies that happen to have their conferences in Alabama, you would use the same Form 5, just at the top where it says, their destination, it would be Orange Beach, Alabama, or wherever they were using in Alabama, but you would use the same Form 5 for that in-state with actual expenses. That way, you're able to claim the hotel, the mileage, and all of those, and you're not subjecting them to the in-state per diem or food reimbursement rate.
Does it include the supporting documents?
Yes, same supporting documents. You would treat it just like
an out-of-state.
an out-of-state travel.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. On the meals and lodging receipts for the expense report, what did you say about an affidavit for a completely missing receipt?
For a completely missing receipt, on that bottom of that expense report, on the bottom of the missing meal receipt, have the traveler write a statement saying that, they lost that receipt, sign it and date it. Or if it would be more beneficial, a second page. But if it'll fit on the bottom of that missing meal receipt form, have them put it there.
Okay. Do we have any more questions?
I have a list of things that you said to remind you about.
Go ahead, Ms.
On the missing meal receipts, if the restaurant only provides one receipt and it lists both parts on that one receipt, is that acceptable?
What do you mean about both parts?
It lists the itemized items, and then down below it lists the portion of the payment.
Yes. that is acceptable. Also, if you have the itemized portion and they paid cash, just show that they paid cash on the bottom of that receipt. But if both portions are on the same receipt, that is acceptable. Yes?
Okay, how would we go about with the deployed, if somebody's deployed for emergency preparedness, since you can't do that in 6 weeks beforehand, so.
So emergency preparedness, that's a separate issue because we do have, like we just had a Hurricane Irma this weekend, had Hurricane Matthew last year. Those are a special, specific blanket travel that's issued by the governor's office. What we would do is I would coordinate with Angie Wright. We would get a list of those travelers who volunteered to deploy. We would get their home addresses. We would find out where they're deploying from, whether it's their home base, their work base, or a coordinated point, and we would get that information to the governor's office. The governor's office would require that and then 2 maps, one from their home base and one from their deployment, their work base, to, if they had to drive from Anniston here to the central office, you would do those maps to the central office. And whichever round trip mileage was lesser, that's what they would claim. So if it was lesser to drive from their work base, you would give them that round trip mileage. Once we submit their personal information and their mileage maps to the governor's office, they would return a blanket travel request for that specific event. And then we would use that as their approval and for their reimbursement for their meals or anything else. And I believe Angie is working on the one for those who deployed for this past weekend.
You were reminded about the travel, when to purchase airline tickets?
Okay, question. When to purchase airline tickets? Airline tickets cannot be purchased by a traveler, nor can conference registrations be paid for or hotels be reserved until you have received state health officer approval. If you purchase your airfare ticket, reserve your hotel, pay for your conference registration before you receive state health officer approval, and for some reason you do not travel, you will not be eligible for reimbursement for those expenses. So, to protect the traveler and to protect your money, do not purchase your plane ticket, reserve your hotel, or pay for your conference until you have state health officer approval to travel.
Third-party pay versus state federal funds.
Okay. Another question that came up was, what if ADPH isn't paying for it? Alpha's paying for it, or Public Health Laboratories is paying for it, or CDC is paying for it. It does not matter where the funds are coming from. As a state of Alabama employee, you must ensure that your travel request and your flights and your driving matches standard business. So if you are attending San Diego and Public Health Laboratories is paying for it, you cannot request personal time and they pay for that ticket. If Public Health Laboratories is paying for it, it must adhere to state business. If CDC is paying for it, it must adhere to state business. As a state of Alabama employee, your entire travel package should adhere to state business.
Risk management.
Okay. There was a question about risk management, and if you took personal time, would you be covered on the flight returning home on personal time after your state business ended? Because you are a state of Alabama employee, risk management does cover you on the departure and on the return, even if you are on personal time. However, when you get off the airplane and you leave the airport, you would no longer be covered if you took personal time on that front end until your state business starts. Or if you took personal time on the back end, when you leave that hotel up until you get to the airport, at the end of your state business until you get to the airport, you would not be covered by risk management. However, during your travels, you would be covered.
PO boxes and
Okay.
GHRS.
Back to the EMAP addresses and making sure that your EMAP address, the address that you put on your travel form, matches GHRS. Sometimes we have employees that use PO boxes. If a PO box is their EMAP address, we still need a physical street address. So you would put 2 addresses for that one employee on the personal info insert. However, you need to verify with your employee what address is correct, because that's the only address they could have in EMAP. So if they would prefer that their P.O. box be the one in EMAP, you would just supply the street address whenever they travel. But verify that they have the correct single address in GHRS.
Okay, and again, I want to remind anyone, if you have a question, you can email us or call us. I have a couple more email questions for you. So the first one's a hypothetical situation. It says, I'm wondering how it would be handled to get reimbursement for my expenses. I've been attending a conference, and on the day I'm scheduled to travel home, I make it to Atlanta, and then my connecting flight back to Montgomery is canceled. The only option is to spend the night in Atlanta that I have not planned on being gone, and you have an added hotel expense to that. Or you could get a rental car that was not already on that travel form in order to travel home for Atlanta. What should they do?
Okay. And we have had that situation happen. Flights do get delayed all the time. They get canceled because of pilot illness, mechanical issues, weather. The most common case is when you return home, we would file an amendment for whatever you actually did. We do have travelers that do opt to spend the night in Atlanta and be rebooked on the earliest flight. That may require spending the night in the airport. That may require the airline putting you up in a hotel. Make sure you always have documentation from the airline stating that your flight was canceled and that you just didn't elect to not board that flight. So always, always, always keep your documentation, keep your cancellations. If they text you, take screenshots. If you have the app on your phone, take screenshots. If you have the emails, print them out. But you do have the option of being rebooked on that next flight. Or you do have the option, if you come home and you rent that car, we would do an amendment. And it would be manual, so it would delay your reimbursement I can't give you an exact time of how long it would delay your reimbursement, but it would delay your reimbursement. We would cancel that original travel. It would be like it never existed, and we would start from scratch from the beginning with a new pre-approval, with the new information, with the supporting documentation of the cancellation or the delay. And once we get that new pre-approval, then you could file for your expenses and reimbursement. But the best thing to do would be to stay at the airport and see if you could get rebooked.
Okay, and one other question that I have is, are snacks acceptable for reimbursement? Could you please kind of elaborate on that?
Snacks are not acceptable for reimbursement. The comptroller will reimburse meals, not snacks. Like I said, if you have any health issues, then you would provide that documentation from your doctor or a signed statement, with the supporting documentation stating that you have to eat ever so often, X amount of meals a day, and what qualifies as a meal. If you choose to purchase groceries instead of food, you would list that on the receipt of, you purchased this for breakfast or you purchased this for lunch. It's always something and, a beverage and, a bagel and, crackers and a Coke. It's always something and. It's not just that one item, not just the crackers, not just the bagel, not just the bottle of water. Those would be considered snacks that the comptroller will not reimburse.
All right. That's all the questions that I have. Does anyone else in the audience have any questions before we wrap things up?
Would it be safe to tell your travelers not to eat in Alabama?
We do have some bureaus and we do have some travel designees that tell their travelers when they're traveling out of state, do not eat after you cross the state line. Do all of your eating before you cross that state line. Because like I said, within 30 to 45 minutes of your base, you will not be reimbursed for that meal. It's kind of hard to judge. So if you're in Atlanta and you have to drive back 45 minutes, that's going to put you in Auburn. You may not get hungry until you get to Auburn, but anything after that you would not be able to claim. So in that case, I would say eat in Atlanta. So it case by case basis, bureau specific, but you can tell your travelers don't eat after they cross the state line. Okay.
Any more questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for watching today. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Chandra, for sharing your knowledge with us. You'll be able to watch this program on the on-demand section of our website. You can go to alabamapublichealth.gov/ALPHTN. Thanks so much. Have a good day. What do you mean when I fumble?